The morning unfolded with the kind of stillness that only deep woods can hold. The sun lingered low behind the trees, and mist clung to the gravel road like a living thing. I stood on the porch, coffee warm in my hand, listening to the faint hum of insects waking to the light. For a while it felt like any other day, a quiet ritual of calm, the steady rhythm of solitude I had built over years of deliberate distance from noise and control. Then I saw movement near the gate. At first it seemed harmless. Two figures stood by the fence line, half veiled by the morning haze. One of them, a woman in a pastel blazer, moved with the confidence of someone who had never been questioned. Beside her a man held a clipboard, his posture deferential, his pen already moving as if documenting what belonged to him. Even from the distance, their energy carried the unmistakable air of intrusion disguised as procedure. The woman pointed toward my cabin with a gesture that combined ownership and dismissal. The man nodded and scribbled. They looked like a scene lifted from a real estate brochure, two professionals discussing property details. But the property they surveyed was mine. A small, hand-painted gate stood between us, the same gate I had repaired with my father years before, its hinges worn smooth by weather and time. Seeing strangers treat it as an exhibit stirred something cold beneath my calm. The details formed slowly. The white "For Sale" sign staked in the dirt, the fresh padlock on the gate that wasn't mine, the clipboard filled with papers stamped with an authority I had never granted. Everything was too deliberate, too organized to be random. I felt the shift before I fully understood it. My home was being claimed without my knowledge. The act was quiet, bureaucratic, and bold. I moved closer, my steps measured, the gravel crunching under my boots. The air around the gate smelled of damp pine and metal. The woman stood firm, her presence sharp against the muted tones of the forest. Her smile, thin, calculated, rehearsed, spoke of someone who had perfected the art of false civility. The man beside her avoided my eyes, already shrinking beneath the weight of whatever he'd agreed to participate in. For a moment, I simply observed. Anger at first wanted to rush in, but years of discipline taught me restraint. I'd learned that silence unsettles the guilty faster than shouting. Instead of confrontation, I turned toward the shed. Inside, the familiar scent of oil and cedar steadied me. Hanging from the wall was an old steel chain, a weathered padlock, and a red metal sign I had bought long ago but never used. Private property. No trespassing. When I returned to the gate, the forest had gone still again, as if watching. The chain slipped through the bars with a satisfying weight. The padlock clicked shut, and the sign caught the first edge of sunlight. The gesture was simple but final, a declaration written in metal rather than words. The man's hand hesitated mid-air, his clipboard lowering slightly. The woman's face hardened into composure, a mask of authority beginning to crack. Beyond the fence, their voices dropped into anxious murmurs I couldn't quite make out, the rhythm of control beginning to falter. I took another slow sip of coffee, the bitter warmth grounding me as I turned back toward the porch. The cabin behind me stood silent, its weathered boards glowing faintly in the soft light. Every beam, every nail, every scar on the wood carried a history that couldn't be rewritten by paper or signatures. As I set my mug down on the railing, a clarity settled in. What I had just witnessed wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a calculated move, a quiet theft dressed as procedure, the kind of theft that thrives on compliance and fear, the kind that counts on people to look away or give up. But this land had been claimed by sweat and patience, not paperwork. The air no longer felt peaceful, it felt electric. Some battles begin without warning, in silence, in sunlight, in the space between someone's assumption and your right to exist. This was one of them. The following hours passed in an uneasy rhythm. The air that once carried only the scent of pine now felt charged, disturbed, as if the land itself sensed intrusion. The strangers lingered by the gate longer than they should have, their movements quick and hushed, their certainty beginning to unravel. When they finally left, tire tracks cut deep into the damp gravel, pressed like fingerprints of arrogance. I walked the perimeter slowly, tracing the edge where ownership met presumption. The for sale sign remained lodged in the soil, its white surface bright against the forest floor. It didn't belong there, yet it stood bold and unshaken, a false claim made visible. The replaced lock glinted in the fading light, a quiet insult sealed in metal. The act wasn't random. It was planned, polished, and practiced. By afternoon, the forest's calm returned, but it was no longer peaceful. It felt watchful. Every sound, the shifting branches, the creak of the porch boards, echoed with something unspoken. I collected the sign, turned it in my hands, and studied the printed name at the bottom. It was more than an administrative trespass. It was an attempt to rewrite history, to erase identity through paperwork and pretense. Inside the cabin, the air was cooler. I stood by the window watching the road curve away into shadow. The light filtered through the trees in uneven patterns, slicing the quiet into fragments. I realized that what had happened wasn't just an attempt to steal land. It was a challenge, a test of how much I valued the ground beneath my feet. And as the evening settled in, a calm, deliberate resolve began to take shape. This wasn't over. It had only begun. The following days unfolded with a strange precision, as if the rhythm of my life had been quietly rewritten. Every morning, the same soft fog rolled down the hill. The same sunlight brushed across the cabin walls, yet something beneath it had changed. The land no longer felt untouched. It felt observed. I noticed small signs first, details so subtle they could have been mistakes. A gate latch shifted half an inch lower. A footprint near the mailbox, too heavy to be mine. The faint imprint of tires where no one should have driven. Each trace carried the same invisible signature of entitlement, a silent reminder that someone believed this place could be taken. The for sale sign reappeared one morning, this time planted deeper, the edges pressed flat against the soil as if someone wanted it to look permanent. The lock on the gate gleamed, freshly oiled. Whoever had done this wasn't acting in impulse. They were methodical, confident, accustomed to being obeyed. Inside the cabin, the air grew still. I reviewed the land documents stored in a worn folder on the table. My father's handwriting on the original title, faded but unbroken. The notary seal still embossed deep into the paper. That document was more than proof. It was inheritance turned into testimony. It meant that every nail, every plank of this cabin carried a lineage that no board or committee could erase. By the time the sun began to fall, my decision was quiet and absolute. I wouldn't argue, wouldn't plead, wouldn't send letters to people who thrived on bureaucracy. I would document, I would record. Whatever was being built around me, rumor, manipulation, or fraud, would collapse under the weight of its own evidence. The forest, once a sanctuary, had become a witness, and I would make sure it remembered everything. Days turned to weeks, and the calm that followed was too clean to trust. No new signs appeared, no intrusions, no voices at the edge of the property. Yet the silence itself grew heavy, unnatural, like air before a storm. I began to notice the rhythm of absence. No mail, no visitors, no word from the association office. It was as if the neighborhood had collectively turned its face away, pretending not to see the quiet theft happening at its border. The cabin stood firm, but the unease crept through the walls. Each night I checked the locks, the lights, the cameras, the small network of vigilance I'd built. It wasn't fear that kept me awake. It was awareness, the sharpened instinct that something was moving just beyond what I could see. At dawn, mist crawled across the grass like breath. I stood by the window, watching the trail curve toward the main road. A crow perched on the fence, its cry cutting through the fog. It felt like a warning. Somewhere beyond those trees, people were planning their next move, drafting new paperwork, constructing another lie. I realized then that this was no longer a single act of trespass. It was an operation, layered, deliberate, protected by silence and influence. The woman who had stood at my gate was not simply enforcing rules. She was building an illusion of authority large enough to swallow truth whole. I poured another cup of coffee and sat at the table, the weight of the title documents beside me. Whatever came next, I knew one thing with absolute clarity. I wouldn't wait for permission to defend what was already mine. The storm hadn't arrived yet, but I could feel it gathering, breath by breath, just beyond the tree line. The first letter came folded neatly inside a white envelope with a gold-embossed HOA crest. Its tone was polite but poisonous. Notice of violation, unauthorized alterations to property access. According to it, I had modified a community gate without approval and obstructed potential buyers. The words were formal, wrapped in the kind of official language designed to sound unquestionable. I recognized the tactic immediately: bureaucratic intimidation, masquerading as order. Over the next few days, more letters followed, each one slightly more aggressive. They accused me of impeding administrative duties, creating a hostile environment, and damaging community reputation. It was surreal to read my life rewritten in false legal phrases. Every sentence was meant to corner me into submission. I studied each envelope carefully: the paper, the seal, the font. The HOA logo was printed with slight inconsistencies, like it had been copied from a scan. The signatures were generic, stamped rather than written. It wasn't coming from the county or the official HOA office. It was coming from her, Doreen Brooks. She wasn't enforcing community regulations. She was fabricating them. I decided to gather evidence methodically. I photographed the envelopes, cross-referenced timestamps, even checked the metadata from the printer that had produced them. An old model used in the HOA clubhouse. She had turned her position into a weapon, manufacturing authority to disguise theft. Neighbors started avoiding eye contact. Conversations that used to happen by mailboxes ended with nervous glances toward her house. The illusion of order in Evergreen Glen was crumbling, but fear held it together. Doreen didn't need to yell. Her rules had already colonized everyone's silence. That evening, I stood by the gate again, the for sale sign gone but its absence heavy with implication. Power, I realized, doesn't need to announce itself. It just needs people to stop questioning. The letters had one purpose: to make me doubt my own claim, to weaken truth through repetition. But I had something stronger than signatures on counterfeit paper. I had proof, real, dated, notarized, undeniable. I just had to wait for the right moment to let it speak louder than her lies. The breaking point came not with noise, but with quiet precision. One morning, the hum of tires rolled up the dirt road again. I watched through the window as a white SUV stopped by the gate. Doreen stepped out, dressed like she was attending a press conference rather than trespassing. Two men followed, broad-shouldered, wearing matching navy jackets with no insignia. They approached with purpose. One carried a clipboard, the other a small tool bag. I saw the flash of metal, bolt cutters glinting in the sunlight. I didn't move. I wanted to see how far they would go. The cameras captured everything. Doreen pointing at the chain, one of the men cutting it open, the other taking photos of the property like it already belonged to someone else. I walked outside only after the deed was done. The gate hung open, the lock broken, the air thick with the audacity of trespass. Doreen stood tall, the wind lifting her hair like a flag of victory. She had that same smile, sharp, deliberate, hungry for control. But the difference now was that I didn't feel anger. I felt calculation. Every second of this was recorded, archived, time-stamped. Every step she took was a confession in progress. When they left, I didn't chase them. I repaired the gate, installed a second layer of locks, and backed up the footage in 3 different drives. Then I printed still frames. Doreen's face clear in the lens, the fake officers at her side, the bolt cutters mid-swing. Each image was a page in the story she had written for herself. A story that was about to turn against her. That night, the forest was completely still. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. I sat on the porch with the red warning sign beside me, my coffee cooling in the cup. The line between peace and confrontation had vanished. There was no going back to the illusion of harmony. The moment she crossed that gate, she stopped being an authority. She became evidence. The tension around my cabin thickened with each passing day. Doreen stopped pretending politeness. She began circling the property with that same realtor, clipboard in hand, whispering like they were conspiring over something precious. I knew she wasn't done. Her type never leaves quietly. That's when I decided to prepare my own plan. I printed every document tied to my ownership: deed, tax receipts, notarized transfers, even photographs of the original signing with my father years ago. Then I organized my surveillance setup: cameras around the gate, motion sensors near the shed, and an old trail cam pointed toward the road. I wasn't going to be surprised again. The following morning, the air carried that uneasy quiet before a storm. I watched from my porch as Doreen paced near the mailbox, pretending to check her phone while waiting for someone. Moments later, a sleek SUV rolled up the dirt road. Not the sheriff's, not the realtor's. Something different. A man in a suit stepped out, tall, polished, confident. He surveyed the property like it already belonged to him. That's when I realized this wasn't just neighborhood greed anymore. It was business. Doreen had found buyers, and they weren't amateurs. I didn't confront them. Not yet. Instead, I let the cameras collect every second. The handshake, the discussion, even the man pointing toward my porch. All of it captured. They left after 10 minutes, but the sense of intrusion lingered long after the sound of tires faded. I checked the footage again that night, zooming in on the SUV's license plate and the company names stenciled faintly on the clipboard: Harper and Vale Investments. I had never heard of them, but the pattern was familiar. Quick acquisitions, false signatures, coerced sales. For the first time, I realized how deep this might run. The HOA wasn't just bullying homeowners, it was feeding something larger, a machine that turned intimidation into profit. My anger hardened into focus. Doreen thought she'd found her leverage, but she'd just given me mine. 2 days later, the trap unfolded without a word from me. I woke early to the sound of tires on gravel. When I stepped outside, Doreen stood at the gate again, clipboard in one hand, confidence in the other. Behind her was the same black SUV, engine idling. The suited man was back, joined by another wearing aviators and holding a leather folder. They spoke briefly, then started walking along the fence line, pointing at markers in the ground as if appraising a property they already owned. The absurdity would have been funny if it weren't so invasive. I stayed still, letting them believe I wasn't watching. The cameras were recording everything, catching the moment the stranger lifted my lock and replaced it with a new one, shiny and unfamiliar. They had done it again, changed my access, rewritten my ownership in plain sight. My coffee went cold in my hand, but my anger stayed focused. When they left, I checked the gate. The lock was real, industrial grade, freshly installed. A thin sticker on the side bore the same initials I had seen before: H&V. Harper and Vale were no longer lurking in the background. They were moving openly now, confident that their papers and signatures were enough to erase a man's name from his land. I spent that evening compiling evidence: video stills, timestamps, copies of every message from Doreen. I even printed the forged sale notice she had distributed to the HOA mailing list. Every detail added another nail to their coffin. They believed ownership was just a document, a thing that could be replaced or rewritten. But I had something stronger than their ink: proof, and a memory that refused to fade. That night I set my own lock over theirs and hung a second sign: Trespassers will be prosecuted. The metal gleamed under the porch light. For the first time, I felt like I wasn't the one under siege. I was fortifying what was mine. The confrontation came the next morning. The sun hadn't fully risen when the hum of an engine broke the silence. This time it wasn't Harper and Vale. It was a county patrol truck, silver paint flashing under the early light. The sheriff stepped out, broad-shouldered and calm, the kind of man who had seen enough lies to recognize one from a distance. Doreen was already there, standing beside the SUV, her expression caught between satisfaction and nerves. She had called him, probably expecting support. I stood on my porch, waiting. The sheriff walked up to the gate, glanced at the locks, then turned toward me with a measured look. He didn't need my side of the story yet. He could already feel the tension in the air. Doreen spoke first, her tone rehearsed. She claimed I was illegally occupying the property, that the HOA had authorized its sale, and that she was acting on official orders. The sheriff listened without interrupting, hands on his belt, eyes steady. When she finished, He simply asked for paperwork. That was her mistake. She handed over the folder with the same forged documents, signatures that didn't match, a transfer I'd never signed. The sheriff turned each page slowly, his face unreadable. Then he asked for identification from the two men in the SUV who had followed her. Their badges had no county markings. Their names didn't match any record. It took less than 5 minutes for him to see what I already knew. The entire operation was built on fraud. When he turned toward me, there was no doubt left. "I'll need a copy of your original deed," he said evenly. "If what I think is true, we're not dealing with a neighborhood dispute. This is a criminal case." As he spoke, Doreen's composure cracked. The realization that her empire of paperwork was crumbling before her eyes showed in the way her jaw tightened and her gaze darted toward the SUV. The man in the suit looked away. By the time the sheriff left, I knew the balance had shifted. What began as an HOA disagreement had just become an official investigation. That evening, the forest surrounding my cabin felt different, tense, listening. The day's events had left a strange stillness in their wake, the kind that comes before something breaks. I locked every door, checked every camera feed, and waited. The sheriff had promised to verify the records. But deep down, I knew people like Doreen and her investors rarely surrendered without trying something desperate. Around midnight, the wind shifted, carrying the faint hum of an approaching engine. Headlights flickered through the trees, not from the county patrol, but a smaller vehicle creeping along the dirt road with its lights dimmed. My gut tightened. On the monitor, two figures appeared, moving fast, carrying something heavy between them. When the infrared picked up the outline of a red gas can, my suspicion hardened into certainty. They thought they could erase the problem, burn the evidence, silence the resistance, finish the job Steele had hinted at. But they hadn't planned on me waiting. I stepped out quietly, shotgun in hand, not to harm, but to make a statement. When the bolt clicked, the sound sliced through the night like thunder. The men froze mid-motion, one dropping the can, the other spinning toward the trees. My voice cut the silence. "Private property. You've got 5 seconds to explain why you're carrying gasoline to a locked gate." Their excuses came fast and useless. Maintenance, misunderstanding, wrong address. Lies crumble under light, and mine was the floodlight mounted above the gate, now blazing bright. They squinted, caught in its glare, hands trembling. I didn't have to raise my voice again. Moments later, the familiar hum of a patrol truck rolled up the road. The sheriff had doubled back, following his instincts. What happened next unfolded with calm precision. The men were cuffed, the gas cans sealed as evidence, the fake uniforms tossed into the truck bed. I handed over my phone with the night's recording and, more importantly, the audio I had captured earlier. Connor Steele's voice, clear and cold, saying the words, "Plan B, do it tonight." The sheriff listened once, then twice, his expression tightening. There was no debate left. By dawn, arrests had been made. Doreen was charged with fraud and criminal trespass, Steele with conspiracy to commit arson and property theft. The so-called investors behind Harper and Vale were exposed as a shell operation running similar scams across the county. My cabin, my land, and my name were restored in the records before the sun even cleared the ridge. When the sheriff came back one last time to return my documents, he simply said, "You built a solid case." I nodded, grateful but drained. Some fights don't need victory speeches, just truth documented properly. That night I replaced the old private property sign with a new one, brighter, sturdier, bolted to the gate. It read, "Protected land, owner verified." The metal gleamed under the porch light like a small badge of justice. I took a long breath, the forest settling again around me. As the wind moved through the pines, I thought of my father, the man who had taught me that land isn't just soil. It's memory, effort, and belonging. They tried to steal it with signatures and threats, but they forgot the one thing they couldn't buy: proof.